He built America's financial system from scratch, yet died broke. Alexander Hamilton was one of the most brilliant minds of the founding era, but his life ended in a bloody duel over pride and politics. Long before the wars, the politics, and the power, there was an island. Quiet, humid, swept by salt and wind. Nevis, in the British West Indies, sat small and almost invisible on the map of the world. But in the mid-18th century, that's where one of history's sharpest minds was born, Alexander Hamilton. Or maybe not. You see, even his birth is a riddle. Some records say he was born in 1755, others insist it was 1757. Alexander himself sometimes seemed unsure, or perhaps he wanted to forget. What we do know is that he was born into nothing. His mother, Rachel Fawcett, was of French Huguenot descent. She had once been married to a Danish merchant, but that relationship crumbled. Her divorce wasn't recognized by the church, so when she began a relationship with James Hamilton, Alexander's father, it was considered scandalous. They were never legally married, which made young Alexander illegitimate. That word carried weight back then. Heavy weight. It meant doors closed before you could knock. It meant whispers in the street. It meant shame you didn't earn, but had to carry. Alexander grew up surrounded by economic hardship. His father struggled to find steady work. His mother, although resourceful and determined, couldn't shield him from poverty. The family moved from Nevis to St. Croix, trying to build a life, but bad luck followed them like a shadow. When Alexander was around 11, James Hamilton abandoned the family, likely ashamed and unable to provide. 2 years later, Rachel died of a fever, likely yellow fever, leaving Alexander and his older brother orphans. Just like that, everything was gone. Alexander was barely a teenager. He had no father, no mother, no inheritance, no title. But he had two things that would carry him further than any noble name could: his mind and his pen. And while the world saw just another colonial orphan, small, skinny, and forgettable, Alexander Hamilton was already quietly preparing to prove them all wrong. Because sometimes the people with the least end up doing the most. After his mother's death, young Alexander Hamilton was left with little more than her name and the burden of survival. He and his brother were taken in by a cousin, Peter Lytton, but that refuge didn't last. Within a year, Lytton died by suicide. Alexander was once again homeless. Not yet 14, he had no stable shelter, no family to lean on, and no education beyond the basics his mother had managed to give him. He found work as a clerk at an import-export firm run by a merchant named Beekman and Kruger on the island of St. Croix. It wasn't glamorous. He handled invoices, tracked cargo, calculated currency exchanges, and kept ledgers. But for a boy with a hungry mind, it was a school in itself. Day by day, Alexander absorbed the rhythms of commerce, learning how the world really worked, not in textbooks, but in ships and sugar and debt. He was trusted, efficient, and sharp. By the time he was 15, he was left in charge of the entire business when the owner was away. Think about that. Most teenagers couldn't be trusted to sweep a floor properly. Alexander was managing trade routes. But the sea air wasn't filled with opportunity. It was thick with slavery, economic despair, and colonial hierarchy. Alexander saw it all up close, and he hated it. He started writing. His letters were thoughtful, observant, sometimes poetic. They weren't just teenage ramblings, they had power, structure, and vision. He'd write about hurricanes as if describing a god's fury. He'd discuss politics, faith, morality. Then came the storm. In 1772, a hurricane tore through St. Croix. It ravaged buildings, sank ships, and left the island gasping. In the aftermath, Hamilton wrote a detailed account of the disaster for the local newspaper. But it wasn't just a news report, it was art. A 15-year-old boy described wind and water with the grace of a novelist and the insight of a philosopher. Local leaders read the piece and were stunned. Who was this boy? How did he write like that? They passed around his essay. They started whispering, then they started collecting donations. The people of St. Croix, impoverished and rebuilding, gathered enough money to send this orphan boy to America. Because even in darkness, genius glows. In the fall of 1772, Alexander Hamilton left the Caribbean behind. He boarded a ship bound for the American colonies, clutching the hopes of the people who believed in him and the burden of becoming someone who mattered. He was just a teenager, barely 16, possibly younger, but he already carried himself like a man racing time. When he arrived in Boston and later made his way to New York, the world looked completely different. Crowded streets, churches, dockyards, colleges. This wasn't St. Croix. This was chaos, opportunity, fire. He enrolled at King's College, what we now know as Columbia University. It was one of the finest schools in the colonies, and Hamilton wasted no time. He devoured books like a starving man. He studied law, philosophy, economics, political theory, anything and everything. But learning wasn't enough. Not for him. He wanted to speak. He wanted to write. And more than anything, he wanted to shape the world around him. The colonies, meanwhile, were teetering on the edge of revolution. Tensions with Britain had reached a boiling point. Taxes, soldiers, tyranny. The streets pulsed with the electricity of rebellion, and Hamilton stepped right into it. He started writing political